right, good morning, church, here at Cornerstone, Boulder. And I was not referring to the building. That word church, the Greek is ekklesia. It means gathering, assembly, and that's what we are. We're a community of people who want to live and love the way Jesus lived and loved. And the message, by the way, I love the line in that video. I wish, it's not going to get on our video that's being taped here, but that line that Mel Gibson said, "Some of you think you are leaving home, but we're really going to what home was meant to be all along, a place where people have your back." I love that. I love that. It's sad that you have to go to war to learn that lesson. May we learn it without having to go to war. Last week, the message was called Jesus Goes Viral, and it was about how we're all called to be Jesus' witnesses in the world. Remember, Acts 1:8 says, "Go into all the world, you should be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea, and Samaria and Judea and all the rest of the world." And so we're called to go into the world to show them how to live and love the way Jesus lived and loved. When the world sees us living like this, it's extremely contagious, and it spreads quickly like a virus. And this week, we're going to see how the Jesus virus, which Jewish believers back then believed could only infect them, crossed over and began to spread quickly into the non-Jewish world. Today's message is called, "Why is God Saving Gentiles?" Oi. And that might seem like an odd question to ask, but not when you realize that in the first century, the Jewish people had developed some very strong prejudices toward the non-Jewish world that not only caused Jews to distance themselves from non-Jews and to often treat them as the outcasts of society, it caused them to mistakenly believe that the promised Messiah was only for Jews and not for anyone else. And so by asking the question, why is God saving Gentiles today? There's a couple important lessons for all of us to learn about God's radical love and his radical plan for both Jews and Gentiles. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Why is God saving Gentiles? Reason number one, because God's love extends to everyone. Now, we haven't been saying this all along, but we've covered now the first 10 chapters of Acts. Do you know that in those 10 chapters, it also spans a decade, 10 years. 10 years has gone by since Jesus has ascended now into heaven. And we get to Acts chapter 10. Up till this point, it's been an exclusively Jewish movement. Literally thousands upon thousands of Jews have come to faith in the Messiah, and this new faith movement has now spread into all of Israel and even beyond. And at this point in church history, no one was thinking, no one was even trying to reach outside of the Jewish community. The reason is because at this time in history, Jews were taught that non-Jews were unclean. And this caused quite a bit of discrimination and intolerance and even hatred towards Gentiles. There were some non-Jews back then who considered themselves worshipers of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they were still considered to be unclean and were not allowed to fully engage into Jewish community. For instance, Jews who came to worship in the Jerusalem temple during the first century, which was the second temple, which was built by Nebuchadnezzar, but then expanded by King Herod. King Herod had built something called the outer court, also known as the court of Gentiles. And Gentiles could only go as far as the outer court. There was even a sign at the entrance of that place that warned non-Jews not to enter under penalty of death. Acts chapter 21, we see an example of this where the Apostle Paul is accused by the Jewish community, the non-believing Jewish community, of defiling the holy temple by bringing Gentiles into it. And the crowd is so worked up that they even try to kill Paul. And so you can see how the attitude of Jews toward non-Jews back in those days was one of discrimination and intolerance. Jews back then went to great lengths to avoid Gentiles, if at all possible. The problem is that God never commanded such a thing in the Torah. There's no mitzvah in the Torah about Gentiles being unclean or about avoiding them. Those were merely man-made rabbinic rules that fueled discrimination, intolerance, and hatred towards them. The father of the Jewish people, Abraham, who was Abram originally, God changes his name to Abraham in Genesis 17:5, which means exalted father, which he was saying is that you are going to be the father of many goyim. That's the Hebrew word, many nations. That's where we get the word Gentiles from that. And if anything, the Torah frequently commands the Jewish people to be a light to the goyim, a light to the nations, not discriminators, not haters. The Jewish people, my Jewish people, were chosen by God to be light bearers for the rest of the non-Jewish world, but their light was barely flickering during the first century. In Acts chapter 10, verse 1, which is where we're going to be today, we're introduced to a non-Jewish man named Cornelius, who lives in a city called Caesarea, which is about 60 miles or so north of Tel Aviv on the coastline. It's where King Herod based out of. Cornelius is a God-fearer, which means he worships the God of the Jews. But being a Gentile, it also means that Cornelius was subject to discrimination and intolerance and even hatred within the Jewish community. In verse 3, we're told that an angel of the Lord comes to Cornelius at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And in verse 5 and 6 tells Cornelius to send some men down to Joppa, to Yaffo, as it is in Hebrew, to retrieve Peter, where Peter is staying at the seaside home of a fellow Jew named Simon the Tanner. Don't miss the detail that Peter is staying in a Jewish home, because it was the only acceptable option for Peter at that time. But hang on, Peter's Jewish worldview is about to be rocked. And I hope it rocks us with him as we see even the deeper implications of this vision that he gets. In verse 9 and 10, the very next day, as those men, those Gentile men, are making their way to Caesarea to Joppa, from Caesarea to Joppa, Peter is up on Simon's roof and he's praying and his tummy starts to growl. He realizes he hasn't had anything to eat yet. He's hungry. And while he's waiting for breakfast or lunch, whatever it is, I don't know how long he's been up there to be prepared, he falls into a deep trance. During the trance, Peter sees what looks like a large sheet being stretched from the four corners of the earth, and coming down on that sheet are all kinds of animals, both clean and unclean. Animals Jews could eat, and animals Jews were forbidden in the Torah to eat. And then in verse 13 and 15, he hears the voice tell him, Peter, get up and eat. And Peter is like in absolute shock. And he says something to the effect of, are you kidding me? No way. I have never eaten anything unclean. And then he hears the voice once again says, what God has called clean, do not call common. This happens 3 more times. And then Peter wakes up, and in verse 17 and 18, we find him being very verklempt. Perplexed. He doesn't know what this means. He's trying to figure out what it means. And of course, God is all about timing. Have you noticed that about God? In his time, in his time. He's all about timing. So just at the moment that these Gentile from Caesarea show up at the house to tell Peter about the vision Cornelius has, that they're there to take Peter to a Gentile home, Peter, who has probably never, ever stepped into the home of a Gentile, has an epiphany moment. The light goes on for him, and he totally understands what God is trying to teach him. And so he goes with the men to Caesarea, and upon entering Cornelius' home, Cornelius falls down at Peter's feet in verse 25. and he begins to worship Peter. You see, the light's gone on for Peter, but Cornelius is still in the dark. And so falling down at Peter's feet to worship, it probably has to do more with Cornelius being afraid than it has to be with anything else. Oh my gosh, there's a Jew in my home. Because the Jewish law is back there, not God's law, but the man-made religious Jewish laws back then. A Gentile could be put to death for violating religious protocol. And having a Jew in his home has certainly put Cornelius on shaky ground. But I love this. Peter grabs him. He touches him. And he lifts him up in verse 26. And he says, stand up. I'm just like you. I'm just a man. And this is one of the most profound, game-changing moments in history. Second only maybe to the resurrection. Because a Jew entering a Gentile's home was taboo enough, but a Jew actually touching a Gentile was unthinkable. But Peter understands this download that he got from God, loud and clear. And so with his arm around Cornelius and noticing that the room is full of more Gentiles, all anxiously waiting to hear what this is all about, Peter says to them in verse 28, and get this should be memorized by every believer on the planet. This is what he says. You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. That's not God's law, by the way. That was just Jewish law at the time. You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. And here's the most important part to get. But, and Peter takes full ownership of this. I love it. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. Oh my gosh. This has got to be a Kodak moment for everybody in that room. I can imagine that the room went deathly silent and you could hear a pin drop after he uttered those words. You see, God, chapter 10, God's not abrogating the Jewish food laws. If that's what you take away from this, you'd be missing the entire context of the lesson. It's a vision. He's not abolishing the food laws. He's abolishing discrimination and intolerance and hatred and demonstrating that his love extends to everyone on this planet. That's the context of chapter 10. In God's economy, no one is unlovable because, as we find out in 1 John 4:8, the very essence of God's nature is love. And so if we say we know God, then love must become a part of our nature as well. That passage in 1 John has sobering implications. The very nature of God is love. So to know God means we are to love everyone. To hate anyone means there's something about God we don't know. Which begs me to ask these two questions of all of us, me included. Here they are. Who do I consider to be unclean today? Unlovable, untouchable. Who do you consider to be unclean? Unlovable, untouchable. Whose home would I never walk into? Or maybe a better way to say it, whose home have I never been in? Think about that. The homeless. See, I know immediately you're thinking, well, they don't have a home. They do. It's just not the kind of home you'd like to visit. It's a sleeping bag in a bush. A week ago, we started allowing 7 homeless people to camp in our courtyard here. They've been here every night. They'll be here every night through the summer. And it's a group of men and women who are in transition. So they're desperately trying to get out of homelessness. And so I stopped by last night to visit them, and they're just finding, places and bushes underneath here. And thank God that it's warm out, and a few of them came to the first service because they were here early in the morning when I got here. So we kind of saw each other. I kissed them goodnight, and I gave them a hug, good morning in the morning. Come hang out with them. They're here at 8 o'clock at night. They're lonely. They're needy. They're looking to be loved and touched. How about gays? Muslims? How about the mentally ill? How about people of a different socio-economical status than you, the poor, or even the wealthy? The wealthy get a bad rap these days. Guess what? They're worthy of being loved as well. How about blacks, whites, browns, Democrats, Republicans? How about Boulderites? How about gluten intolerants? That was for my wife. I love my wife. Time and time again, I love this about Jesus. Time and time again in the Bible, story after story, we see Jesus standing as a buffer between the angry, intolerant, self-righteous religious community and those who were marginalized in society because of the way the religious community treated them. Jesus never fudged on truth. He never condoned sin in any form. But he fought fervently to protect all those who were targets of religious discrimination, intolerance, and hatred. We see this buffer that Jesus created, particularly when he stands between the religious community on this side and the woman caught in adultery on this side, right? Wait a minute. You who without sin, you cast the first stone. And he doesn't condone the sin. You see, it took 2 or more witnesses in order to condemn somebody to death. And so they all drop their stones and walk away. And guess what? Jesus says, well, where are your condemners? Because according to the law, you can only be stoned if you have witnesses. She says, well, they're gone. Well, neither do I condemn you. Go and do whatever you want. No, go and sin no more. He demonstrated particularly when he broke every Jewish taboo and touched a leper when he healed him. Lepers were considered unclean. It was actually an act of love, right? If you have some kind of a disease, separate yourself from the rest of the community until you're better. But there's no commandment, there's no mitzvah that keeps us from touching a leper. And if you want to put yourself at risk, you can. He demonstrated particularly when he healed the man on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. And whenever he entered the homes of society's outcasts, Jesus was always standing as a buffer between the religious community on this side and those who were marginalized by that same community. Who do you consider to be unclean today? Untouchable, unlovable. Whose home would you never walk into or haven't you walked into? Before I move on, let's just read once more what Peter said. This is what he learned. He learned, I can eat all the bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches I ever want. No, that wasn't it. He learned, God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. My guess is that still holds true for us today. You think? I hope so. I hope you think that way. By the way, in the fall, we're going to start a new project called First Things. It's based off when Jesus was asked, well, what do you think is the most important mitzvah? What's the most important commandment? And Jesus couldn't get it down to one. He says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second one is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love others. And so beginning in the fall, we're gonna spend months literally learning how, and not just learning, but actually doing things to teach us how to love God at a deeper level. And then we're gonna encourage you to love your neighbor in two ways. First, your literal neighbor. I mean the people that are on your block. We're going to give you some ideas that are going to be very easy. So if you're starting to sweat in your seat, thinking, oh, I don't want to do this, we're going to make it very painless for you and fun to actually reach out, get to know your neighbors, and draw close to them that way. But then the second neighbor is the neighbors in need. People like the homeless and all this list of people that become marginalized in society. They deserve to be loved. Doesn't matter what their behaviors are, they deserve to be loved. And so that's coming up in the fall. So why is God saving Gentiles? Number one, because God's love extends to everyone. I love this part. Number two, because the Gentiles, it was God's plan that the Gentiles will eventually help Jews find the Messiah. Emphasis on the word eventually, all right? Romans chapter 11, verse 11 says, and it's about as clear as it could be, salvation has come to the non-Jews, to the Gentiles, to make Israel jealous. You see, the book of Romans, if you don't know it, it's written to the church in Rome, which is primarily at that time made up of Gentiles believers. After Acts chapter 10, we begin to see a slow but steady shift from moving where Christianity's center was in Jerusalem, and now it's moving to Rome. It's moving from the majority are Jews coming to faith in Jesus to now it's the majority of Gentiles coming to faith instead. We also begin to see the Gentile believers slowly turning against the Jews. Paul sees these early anti-Jewish signs, and he writes in Romans chapter 9 through 11 particularly to give a strong warning to the church in Rome. And how ironic is it that initially it was the Jews that had a problem with Gentiles. Now it's the Gentiles that have a problem with Jews because discrimination, intolerance, and hatred is one of Satan's favorite weapons of deception, usually elaborately disguised as truth. And after using some strong language, read it later today, about Gentile arrogance towards the Jews that had already developed, Paul tells them that they have a higher calling. And your higher calling is to make the Jewish people jealous so that they would find their Messiah. The Roman church did not listen to Paul. And eventually, because discrimination and intolerance and hatred towards Jews builds and builds and builds, we basically don't see any Jews, it's just negligible, coming to faith in Jesus for the next 1900 years because there's nothing for them to be jealous about. Especially because of the major anti-Jewish historical events like the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the Holocaust, and all the smaller, not insignificant, but smaller in size events in between. If you don't know it, most Jews have spent their time over the last 1900 years trying to figure out how to survive Christianity, rather than having the time to figure out if Jesus is truly the promised Messiah. And that's not to say that there weren't lots of Gentile Christians who stood up for Jews throughout the centuries, because there were, even to the point of risking their own lives, even for dying while trying. God bless all of them. But numbers were dwarfed compared to the vast majority of Gentile Christians who bought into and practiced Jewish hatred. And if what I'm saying to you here is new, you're going, wait. Is that true? I encourage you to do your own research on this topic because it's all over the place now. Or listen to a message I did about 6 years ago called The Dead Elephant, Why Most Jews Believe Christianity Stinks. You know, the dead elephant in your living room, the one that's stinking up and everybody kind of walks around it and pretends like it's not there. And so I did a message on this that's a little more extensive, talking about our history, our Christian history. And you can find an audio version of that message on our YouTube channel. I put it up there yesterday. So if you go to youtube.com Cornerstone Boulder CO. And there's a playlist there called Dead Elephant. The message is inside that playlist. Go ahead and listen to it. It's 6 years old, so I've grown a little bit since then, but you'll get the idea. And I say all this, listen, I bring this up not to be negative about our past, but to be positive about our future. Because as you can see, God has a plan to fix all of this in the storyline. Later on in Romans 11, in verse 25 and 26, Paul says, lest you be wise in your own sight, I want you to understand a mystery. Mysteries are things you can't understand until God decides to reveal them to us. And so he's got something planned that's in the future. It's a mystery. And he says, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Whoa, the fullness of the Gentiles. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. You need to know, here at Cornerstone, we look at the Bible and all of history as one seamless story. From Genesis 1 all the way to Revelation 1 and beyond. It's one story, not two. The old story is not the story of the Jews in the Old Testament, and the New Testament is not the story of the Christians. We see it all as one seamless story for everyone. Moses parting the Red Sea is just as much our story as Jesus resurrecting from the dead, because it's one story. And looking at the Bible and history through these kinds of one seamless story lenses is really the only way to make sense of the Bible and history. When you look at the Bible and history that way, it's easy to stand back. Instead of being stuck in this one place in the story that you and I are stuck in, it's easy to stand back and to realize that God's story, his redemptive storyline, plays out over time, over a long period of time. In the same way, those smaller stories that you and I go to the movies to see and the books that we read plays out in several hours. Not everything happens in the beginning and in the middle. You're going, oi, what's going on? Where is, how's this going to end? And this is how God's story is. God's epic storyline plays out over thousands of years. And when you look at it that way, it helps us understand the difficult parts of the story better. Like maybe the last 1900 years. So here in Romans chapter 11, verse 25 and 26, we're told about a mystery that's going to take place later on in the story called a time that's called the fullness of the Gentiles. That word fullness can mean like a literal number, like 2,600,003, boom, fullness of the Gentiles. Or it could mean some kind of knowledge that is attained. I think both of them are in view. There's a definite number, and there's a certain amount of knowledge that's going to take place. And so Paul is telling us here that at a certain number, and when the certain knowledge takes place, all Israel will be saved, which I believe means that you'll start seeing Jews coming to faith again, once again. That happened dramatically in 1967, the official date for what is called the Jesus Revival. Some of you old hippies will understand that. I bet some of you came to faith during that time. Basically, you had a period of time when the hippie movement was running out of gas, and it had turned more dark than it was light. I don't know if it ever was light. It was kind of fun at moments, you know. I was in that stuff. But it got dark, and us hippies got discouraged, and all of a sudden, there's this revival that breaks out, and all these hippies start turning to Jesus, and a lot of those hippies are Jewish. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Jews like me and so many Jews that are here in this room right now have come to faith in Yeshua. And that's amazing in itself. But we get another prophecy about Gentiles that's told in Luke chapter 21-24. This also took place in 1967. Jesus told his disciples that Jerusalem is going to be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. This is different than the fullness of the Gentiles. And we know that the Romans exiled the Jews out of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., and then you see a trampling of Gentiles in Jerusalem. The Muslims, the Crusaders, then the Muslims again, and then the Ottoman Turks. 1,900 years of trampling. But in 1948, God brought the Jewish people back to Israel, but they did not have the full control of Jerusalem until 1967 during the Six-Day War. They regained full control of Jerusalem for the first time in 1,900 years. Don't you find it amazing? I mean, it's all about timing, right, for God? That these two passages regarding Gentiles were fulfilled during the exact same year. I just got a note that Karen Cox's wedding at Cornerstone at 12 p.m. So you all have to leave. Note to self, turn off Wi-Fi. Okay. Since that time, you know, in the last 60 years or so, we've all been learning so much about how the Jewish roots of Christianity, that Jewish connection dropped off the radar screen soon after the first century. But there's been a revival, a new reformation of sorts to reconnect back to that Jewish connection. You should be proud that Cornerstone has been on the forefront of that reformation. Jews and Gentiles worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob together under one roof. Jews living with their Jewish identity, Gentiles living with your Gentile identity, celebrating the richness of both traditions. Realizing together that Jewish story, and I'm just saying it's a Jewish story, it's our story. The scriptures that we have comes from the Jews. The Messiah that we have comes from the Jews. Salvation comes from the Jews. And so together, you and I locked arm in arm together is a powerful, powerful force to make my Jewish brothers and sisters jealous of their Messiah. I'm excited to be alive in this time. I'm excited to be part of this congregation. And I'm excited to see what God is going to do. Let's pray together. Father, wow, what a story. The story above all the other stories. An incredible storyline that has a lot of twists and turns, nail-biting events. Makes us question sometimes whether there really is a God, or what are you up to, or why are you acting this way here and this way there. It's just a wild story. But nevertheless, it's a story that you wrote. Help us to be able to stand back and see that it's a storyline that plays out over thousands of years. And it has one purpose in mind, to redeem mankind, to redeem this planet. You will one day show up to right every wrong and to take us to ride off into the sunset, to live in that everlasting place that Gabe talked about earlier. We won't be remembered here, but we will be with the one who we should be remembering every moment in our life forever. So help us to see the story that way. And then help us to lock arms even closer, that we might resemble home right here in this community, that we don't have to go off to war to learn what it's like to watch each other's backs, to love each other so deeply and so richly that it's just attractive, not just to Jews, but to anybody who sees it going on. By this you said that all people would know that we're your disciples. So do a work in us. And get us out of our comfort seats, Lord, that we might step into the homes, into the lives of people that we, in our minds, for whatever reason, we think of them as unclean, untouchable, unlovable. Break down those barriers in us and me. Everybody on that list that I read, and even the ones that I didn't include. Teach us, Lord. In Yeshua's name. Amen. Let's stand up.